when it comes to securing your small office or home office, we can always start with the router. And to talk to us more about some of those settings, some of those things to look at, we've got Nicholas Peck. Nicholas, how you doing?
Great. How's it going today?
Yeah, doing great, man. Doing great. Nicholas, what are some of the things that you often have to worry about or look into from a security perspective when you're configuring a small office or home office router?
One of the main things would be making sure your credentials are not the factory credentials, whether it's the router login information, your Wi-Fi credentials like the network name or password, changing it from factory. Also, on a physical level, the ports, which ports are enabled on the LAN. Typically, routers come with 4 LAN ports in the back. Also, if you don't want anyone to access your Wi-Fi, they can access your network through hardwire, and that's another feature in your router that you can disable LAN ports.
So from user credentials to physical ports to wireless ports, there are all those settings in there that you have to think about. Well, what's the particular use for that particular system, and then start locking down or start enabling things as appropriate, right?
Correct. Yep.
Well, let's talk about user credentials, username, password. We know that passwords often show up with the admin username and the admin password, etc. What other issues have you run into, and how do you resolve them?
Yeah, like the credentials for the network and the router administration information is all physically on the router there.
Yeah.
So if you're in whether it's your home or a business, someone's able to get to your router and look under there. They got the information there if you haven't changed it. A major concern with customers when they call in is them not remembering that information, mainly the router administration information. And when they get that confused with network credentials. And when they don't remember router credentials, we have to go through the process of factory resetting the device to basically recreate everything on the router.
So when you do that, do you ever run into two-factor authentication with any of these systems, or are the systems mostly use a username or password? Where does 2FA come in, if at all?
I don't really see it with the routers. There is a remote support feature with some routers that come with the app. If you're using a certain router's app, that rather than the web interface, at setup, there's an option to set up remote support or not. If you set that up, you do not have to be within the router's network broadcast to access the settings feature. So if someone was using this app and they had your credentials from physically looking at the router, they can access your router settings basically anywhere they have an internet connection if that remote support is enabled.
So that's a security issue, but it's also a kind of an admin issue because you probably have to ask people, hey, how are you looking at your router right now? Through the web interface connecting directly to the router or through some sort of app, right?
Correct. Yeah. So mostly residential customers, I try to get them to use the web interface mostly so they're not flooding their phone with apps. Some people do prefer the app. When they do prefer to use the app, if it's a resident, I kind of direct them to not enable the remote support. If it's a business, and I would suggest them to use the remote support, because if you're not in the area, let's say you're out of town on a business trip and something's going up with your network, you're able to use that remote support wherever you are to correct any issues with the router. Otherwise, you would have to have someone on site within the network's broadcast to fix any credentials there or any settings.
Now, an additional setting that is important besides, let's say, credentials, firmware, things like that. How do you, when you're updating firmware or making any sort of change, sometimes that can cause connectivity problems between you and the customer, right? Especially if they're using the router to call you, right, as it were, or going through that router to call you. How do you work out a plan B with folks?
And so right off the back, we figure out how they're contacting us. If they're using VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol,
Mhm.
or if they're using the Wi-Fi to contact us, we would ask them to use their cellular data or landline, because we are going to interrupt the internet connection while updating firmware or rebooting the router if needed, or even completely resetting the router if the firmware update was unsuccessful, or any firmware upgrade requires the router to reboot once it's installed. Yeah.
Nicholas, thanks so much for giving us your insights. It's always great to hear from a working professional, what it means to get your ducks in a row in terms of user credentials, in terms of firmware updates when supporting a small office. I sure appreciate it, man.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.